Hello, my name is Jennifer. Welcome to Stories from the Earth. This is episode 16. I'm here with my co-host Ellen.
Yes, thanks for joining our podcast about story and how to interrelate with the natural world.
Ellen is going to tell us all about a book she's been reading today. It's called Plant Intelligence, and I'm pretty excited I read one of his books, and this is basically the book after that. So I'm pretty excited. So I'm gonna pass this back to Ellen.
We're going to talk about Plant Intelligence and the Imaginal Realm, subtitled Into the Dreaming of Earth. Stephen Buhner. He ties well into our story format, and I think you'll see why by the time we get to the end of this little journey. But a little about him first. Stephen Buhner is a renowned herbalist, an author of at least 23 books, most of which relate to subjects of plants and plants as medicine. But anyone who's familiar with his works or starts getting involved, especially if this book is the inspiration launching point for getting involved in his writing, will come to realize that he delves so much into so much more territory than just here's a plant, this is what it can do, it's all pretty amazing. He describes himself as an interdisciplinary, independent scholar, polymath, and fellow of Schumacher College of the United Kingdom, as well as the lead researcher for the Foundation of Gaian Studies. And a polymath, for those that don't know, is a person with a wide range of knowledge and learning. That's just what that means. And I only learned that term because of him describing himself that way and looking up what it meant. So it's like, that's pretty interesting. I mean, that's kind of a nice goal one could have to really lead a rich and fulfilling life, is to strive to be a polymath. Buhner says, this is from his bio on his website, "I am and always have been interested in the invisibles of life, those meanings and communications that touch us from the heart of Earth and let us know that we're surrounded by more intelligence, mystery, and caring than our American culture admits of. How to re-inhabit our interbeing with the world, how to sit in the council of all of life as kin rather than dominators, and how to live sustainably on this earth that I love more than I know how to say." So if that doesn't sound appropriate for this podcast, I don't know what does.
That does sound right in line with what we have and will continue to be talking about, is like this connection to the natural world that we have really lost.
And I need to recultivate, reignite. I started with his book called Herbal Antibiotics about 15 years ago, and I was impressed by the level of research and citation that was in it, because it was really unlike any other book that I'd at least encountered at that point. And I'd say it still holds up today. I know it's been reissued and reprint a few times, I think, since its original publishing, and it even was popular enough that it inspired his partner book called Herbal Antivirals to kind of offer a counterpoint to the antibacterial side. But those are more his like scholarly, you want to look something up real quick, you need to research and an answer to something. They're good reference books. But most of his other works are more like the one we're going to delve into today, that get a lot more personalized. Last year I read the one that I believe you have, Jennifer, called The Secret Teachings of Plants in the Direct Perception of Nature. And I do recommend that. I think it can be a good lead into this book I'm going to review today, but it might be a little bit more of a difficult read compared to this one. So it doesn't really have to be read before this one. They can stand independently. But I started reading this one. I'm almost done with it. I tried to finish it before this show, but I'm 3 chapters behind.
I feel like, from my experience with that book, I feel like and from what you've been telling me about this book, I feel like people should start with this book.
This one. Well, there was, this one came out in, so Beyond the Doors of Perception, Plant Intelligence in the Imaginal Realm, that we're going to go into today, came out in 2014. The Secret Teachings of Plants came out in 2004. So, you know, a 10-year gap's a pretty generous gap to kind of fully more develop and flesh out an idea. So I think that's kind of what happened between the two, that it makes this one a little bit more cohesive and maybe a little bit more readily understandable to the reader, I think. So
yeah, I think that one just sounded like his ideas weren't fully baked. And that he needed an editor. I don't know if he had an editor, but I feel like it was a little all over the place, which is definitely not what you're describing as experience with this book. So, I mean,
this one has, I think, a little more of a clear vision for continuity of, like, this is like I could imagine being like, this is what I set out to have this book get to from point A to point B, and here's how we're going to get there. Like, it flows a little more in such a way. And I think just be his books could be challenging for some. I mean, I will say, because they have this sort of aura of mysticism, as if the title didn't suggest so, that blends with science, and he has kind of a foot in both those worlds. But I think a lot of people who might be more analytical and scientifically minded could be put off by any hint of mysticism, and then people who might be more mystically inclined are going to have a hard time maybe actually logically or literally grasping the science. So for those types of reasons, I could see it could be a challenge to certain readers on both sides of the fence to really connect to the material. But I'm always somebody who likes to try to find the middle path and things, because I think the truth is usually uncovered somewhere therein. You know, life isn't all or nothing and just black and white. So hence the need to talk about perception and perspective, and one person's culture's mysticism could be another culture's science, and vice versa. So I think humans kind of do themselves a bit of a disservice mentally, emotionally, and even in our own potential if we too strictly limit our focus and beliefs to the point that it becomes like a dogma, and sort of tunnel vision develops, and we kind of block out awareness, acceptance, or willingness to explore anything else that might arise contrary to our bubble. And I mean, you could probably even argue that some of the social issues going on in the world are exacerbated by that sort of problem, you know?
Yeah, definitely. But I also think that a lot of people who, I mean, it's specifically herbalists, but this doesn't have to be, you know, it can be a broader person or someone who doesn't consider themselves like an herbalist. I think by the nature of the plants and where we have placed the plants, we've placed them in an aside in an other space. So I think that like herbalists are used to straddling like two worlds essentially, which is really one world, but we've divided it. So, but definitely from somebody who's unfamiliar with one piece or another, I can see, you know, possibly this book being, you know, maybe a little challenging, because there's a lot of things they might have a lot of concepts that they've come new to. Yeah. Yes.
Well, I will say, to not discourage anyone, because
no, don't do it. Don't discourage. We're not discouraging.
This is because of that challenge it presents. It makes it a really exciting exploration if you go into it open and not even totally with an idea of what you're going to get out of it. Like, you know, yeah, I read I'm familiar with him. I'm familiar with his work. I read the book's, you know, jacket cover. Oh, that sounds interesting. You know, that's as far as, you know, that's what most people are going to do. But beyond that, to not have any expectation and just see what kind of a journey it's going to take you on. I will say, as much as Secret Teachings of Plants had a lot of mind-blowing moments in it for me, this book has had a lot of mind-blowing moments that have helped me take lots of pieces of other information I've learned over the years and distill it into something that I never had thought of before. It's like filler to help create patterns and put together pieces of a larger puzzle that you're like, aha, wow, oh my gosh, you know? So some things I like about this book, he intersperses quotes by people who were known either in their time or maybe posthumously that were keen observers of nature. So that can be not just eloquent writers, but quotes from scientists, doctors, naturalists, poets, explorers, musicians, other artists, and he kind of weaves it together nicely and finds the ways that all of their different ideologies and opinions and observations kind of overlap regarding the feelings that they all ended up sharing about nature and the world that we live in. And midway through the book, he does a bit more illustrating as to why he refers so much to these interesting minds, to the point of peppering his books throughout with quotes. And I think you'll probably remember that from Secret Teachings of Plants. I don't know if that's the book he started doing that in, because I haven't read the one before it, but definitely that one. And in the Plant Intelligence book, he intersperses the text a lot with italicized quotes from some of these people in these other categories to help kind of flesh out and illustrate the point he's making. And if you're not really well read, that's kind of nice, because it adds in an element of like, oh, I don't necessarily, having not read all these people, I at least get an idea of that there's more people who think like that out there. And then if you are well read, you might read it and go, oh, wow, yeah, he knows his stuff because these people he's quoting.
I think it was the book that had the most quotes that I've ever read in it. So
yeah. And this one isn't as much as that one was, but it comes close. It's definitely like his style, I guess, at least for these couple of books.
Yeah, which is, I think it's totally all his own. I've not encountered a writing style like his. Susan Weed's book, her latest, I don't have it here, but oh yeah, I do. This one here, Abundantly Well, has a lot of, I'd say it has like just a titch under, you know, she does a lot of referencing. But yeah, that was I also find that could be a little bit overwhelming too, because I'm like, if I don't know the person who's the quote from, like, oh, I want to look that one up, you know. So it's sort of like, yeah, a little bit distracting, but I have ADD, so you know, I'm distracted anyway. But so it seems like this book can really be a jumping off place.
Yeah. Oh, like, yeah.
That's what he is.
Ooh, and now I want to read that person, and now I want to read that person, and I want to. Yeah. Which he is good about putting a bibliography in the back of his books for specifically that reason, being that he himself is worldly in his knowledge. He clearly believes that it's an important thing and would like to share that with other people. And so if these books and these quotes are helping open people up to wanting to dig more, he's like, okay, well, by the way, here's how you can dig more, and it's all right there in the back of the book. So that's a pretty handy feature. I will go into a few excerpts from the book, just because his writing is so dense in a good way that I can't do it justice just yammering about it. It's got to actually be shared with excerpts to, I think, really start to grasp what he was getting at. So in relation to like the pulling quotes and stuff, I found this part interesting. He says, artists go deep, but natural scientists go very deep. When the world itself is the focus, something new enters the process, something very much alive and intelligent and aware in its own right, and that changes things. We find then that something responds to our questioning, sensing with its own desires and intentions. and the journey itself begins to become something else and something different. That is what people such as Goethe, Luther Burbank, Einstein, Masanobu Fukuoka, and Barbara McClintock did. Einstein once put it this way: look deep into nature and then you will understand everything better. It is where their deep insight came from, and they all knew it, and they all described what they did so that those who wish to follow them can do so. Reductionists hate this, however. The schools do not teach it, and few books contain the story. As Aldous Huxley puts it, literary or scientific, liberal or specialist, all of our education is predominantly verbal, and therefore it fails to accomplish what it's supposed to do. Instead of transforming children into fully formed adults, it turns out students of natural science who are completely unaware of nature as the primary fact of experience, and it inflicts on the world's students of humanities who know nothing of humanity, that their own or anyone else's. Or as ecologist and Gaian researcher Stephen Harding says, no student of ecology is ever introduced to this new mode of mental discipline in school and colleges. There is no culture of experiencing oneness with the natural world. All one does in an ecology trip is collect and measure. Deep contemplation of nature is considered to be at worst a waste of time, and at best something to do in your spare time. Truly great scientists had this connection and this sense of a greater whole of which they were a part. Without educating this sensitivity, we churn out scientists without philosophy who are merely interested in a subject but not thoroughly awed by it. We churn out clever careerists. It is this kind of training which leads us to the mentality responsible for the massive social and environmental mistakes of the Western style of development, trained to shut down perception of the world so that we see it as a mere machine. We're perfectly free to improve on the clockwork for our own ends. And that kind of encapsulates, I think, why he's trying to pull quotes from so many people to emphasize we need to think outside of that box of the rigors of what formal systems tend to ingrain in us, especially if we want to advance in certain ways.
And it's really funny because I am reading Braiding with Sweetgrass, which is another fantastic book. Everyone should read it. And if you can, get the audio version, because the author does the audio, and it's like 17 hours of amazing hardcore, like you will cry. But she's a ecologist, and she describes her experience with, and she's a Native American, and she comes from that culture, so she's bringing a different perspective. But she's talking about how even when she entered school, that they were, she's like,
kind of closed off
to that idea of this experience of nature that he is talking about, and how later on as a teacher, she's trying to instill this in her students. And so, yeah, it's not encouraged. So I would agree with what he's saying. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not encouraged, and it's often, I think, discouraged.
Yeah. So just for those who might not have looked into it and done the jacket cover reading, I think it's worth pointing out the summary of the book just because it'll encapsulate a little more of, because we're not going to dig into all the details of it in this one review. So to encapsulate it, the summary of the book says, Buhner reveals that all life forms on Earth possess intelligence, language, a sense of I and not I, and the capacity to dream. He shows that by consciously opening the doors of perception, we can reconnect with the living intelligence in nature as kindred beings, becoming again wild scientists and non-domesticated explorers of the Gaian world, such as Goethe, Barbara McClintock, James Lovelock, and others have done. For as Einstein commented, we cannot solve the problems facing us by using the same kind of thinking that created them. Buhner explains how to use analogical thinking and imaginal perception to directly experience the inherent meaning and flow through the world that are expressed from each living form that surrounds us, and directly initiate communication in return. He delves deeply into ecological function of invasive plants, bacterial resistance to antibiotics, psychotropic plants and fungi, and most importantly, the human species itself. He shows that human beings are not a plague on the planet. They have a specific ecological function as important to Gaia as all of the plants and bacteria. Buhner shows that the capacity for depth, connection, and meaning-filled communication with the living world is inherent in every human being. It is as natural as breathing and as the beating of our own hearts and as the desire for intimacy and love. We can change how we think, and in so doing, we can begin to address the difficulties of our times. And I think it's so nice that they made sure to include that bit about showing how human beings are not just a plague on the planet, because it's, you look around us, and especially in environmental and ecological circles, it's hard to not have, you know, all of the top alarm bells ringing with what's going on in the world and mass extinction and climate issues and just everything. So to even have people who are highly aware of those problems and are still able to kind of pick through and find hopeful nuggets and make sense of things, I think is really important, at least, you know, for reassurance. I found it very reassuring, you know. He's clearly very inspired by studying the Gaia hypothesis, which is sometimes called Gaia theory or Gaia paradigm or Gaia principle. That was a hypothesis formulated by a chemist named James Lovelock, who he quotes a lot, and a microbiologist named Lynn Margulis back in the 1970s. Lovelock named the idea Gaia based on the primordial goddess who personified the earth in Greek mythology. So that's just kind of where the name came from. I think it's been co-opted and turned quite sort of new agey, maybe based on its time span that it got popular. But he actually, James Lovelock, the sort of founder of the concept, was awarded the, hopefully I'm saying this right, Wollaston Medal, which is the highest award granted for geological science by the Geological Society of London, in part because of his work on the Gaia theory. So that's pretty cool. Gaia theory proposes that living organisms interact with their inorganic surroundings on Earth to form synergistic, self-regulating, complex systems that help maintain and perpetuate the conditions for life to exist on Earth. So topics related to the hypothesis can include biosphere, evolution of organisms, stability of global temperature, salinity of seawater, atmospheric oxygen levels, the maintenance of the hydrosphere of liquid water, and other environmental variables that pertain to the habitability of our planet, basically. And it was initially criticized for being too teleological and against the principles of natural selection. But he made some later refinements to the process over the years that got more recognition in Earth system science and geochemistry and ecology. There's still critics, of course, scientists that consider it's just got weakly supported evidence. And I can see why that there would be skepticism for the theory, and why that skepticism wouldn't jive with somebody like Stephen Buhner, given the excerpt that I just read previously about his sort of view on education being reductionist and kind of separating man's thinking and man's concept of their self from the natural world. You know, you can kind of see why, consequently, there's also going to be plenty of people in the reductionist scientific model that might look at aspects of Gaia theory and go, there's not enough to support this. It's like, that doesn't mean that it might not be there, though. The key to a hypothesis is just a question, and it's worth digging into and exploring. And I think there's pretty convincing, and clearly Stephen Buhner thinks there's pretty convincing evidence that there is some real truth in that.
And I think that, like, I just want to take it back to this. I think we're sort of still on the topic, but the topic about like human beings being like a parasite or whatever, or being bad for the planet. I think that idea is very destructive, because I think that, number one, we're part of the planet, and you know, and we had a role, and at some point we knew what that was, and it's been sort of just, we've been separated from it, you know. And I think, I mean, for me, I think that role was to be able to like take care of the planet, and then and vice versa, it takes care of us. So, you know, and I think that we're, you know, humans are not all terrible. Like, we're not like, we have this idea that we're terrible, you know. I mean,
sort of like the original sin mythology, you know, like we're just flawed, inherently doomed, yada yada.
Right, and we're not perfect, but that doesn't mean that, like, I mean, when you I'm sorry, I was just reading with Sweetgrass, but like, you know, that the ideas in that book is that like we have a gift to give, you know, and that, you know, and then we get it, like, we take care of the plants take care of us. Like, it's just like, there's things that humans can do, and then there's things that plants can do. Like, it's just like, you know, like the trees
capable of more symbiosis than we are currently allowing ourselves, maybe on a cultural level.
Right. I mean, and it's just like the separation that has happened because of it benefits someone. And I don't know where that, you know, everyone's like, where did that split come? I don't know, but we're here. And I think, you know, this book is sort of all about, you know, another way to sort of
taking the steps,
step us back.
Yeah, he actually describes the book as a user's manual about the techniques and states of perception necessary for directly interacting with the Gaian system, perceiving deeper patterns in its movements, and understanding meanings in those patterns. And I think, I mean, human beings have evolved in large part because of our ability to recognize and see and identify patterns, whether or not those are completely in our own head or not is almost, you know, and sometimes maybe they are and sometimes maybe they aren't, but I think that that's kind of a moot point. It's more about what we then are able to accomplish because of sort of seeing a pattern and connecting dots and making things make sense. He goes on to say that in many respects, the book is a manual for becoming a non-domesticated explorer of the natural world, which sounds fun. Something that used to be called maybe like a natural philosopher, that would have been somebody like Henry David Thoreau and things like that. But what might now better be suited to being called a wild scientist as opposed to a domesticated one. So he's not like anti-science.
Right.
He's kind of trying to re-envision and reinvigorate, maybe is a better word, science into that wow and wonder and exploration, which is honestly, it's the reason why a lot of people even go to school for scientific fields to begin with. And whether or not at some point the rigors of the system beat the passion out of them is, well, I mean, then we get back to the issues with the system having caused that in people. You know, it's kind of a sad loss. You know?
I mean, science isn't bad, like, but it's a tool, you know, and it's how you use that tool. And we can, I mean, use it to, you know, help, you know, preserve the planet. We can use it to help F it up some more. So, you know, and I think a lot of people recognize that, you know, like, it's just, it's just another tool, and it's how you use it. So, and
dig into this was hard to try to pull out some of the meat of the book to like entice people to be like, why would you even want to read this beyond, you know, just talking about the overview, which is kind of been so far. I wanted to pull out a little meat from the book, and that's quite a task. And each chapter does sort of build on concepts from the previous, so it's harder to just kind of jump in and be like, this is a great part. So I decided to focus on a few concepts that just really kind of blew my mind. And one that he delves into a lot is something called sensory gating. So basically, we all have a series of gating channels that exist in our neural network, and he suggests that you can sort of visualize that if you imagine a series of locks on a river. It's where you can kind of temporarily dam and control the flow of a river as needed. So there's sort of like a system biologically that processes incoming sensory data flow. And he gives an example. He says, like with the auditory processing of sound, the input first flows through our ear, then to the brainstem reticular formation, then to the medial septum, then to the hippocampal region of the brain, then to the thalamus, then to the auditory cortex, and then it finally ends up in the cerebral cortex. And a sensory gating process is basically happening at every step along those listed neural pathways. And to paraphrase from the book, it basically only what our pre-attentional part of our self determines is important is allowed to reach our conscious awareness. So it's basically the unconscious part that analyzes the sensory input will determine what or what not to let through to our consciousness. And that can vary and function and fluctuate in our lifetime. And it may be part, so like it might be part of us that's focusing on self-protection, or it might be the part of us that's engaging in a sensory phenomenon like the sense of wonder about something, or it could be the part of us that's like reading people. You know, you go to a party and you can kind of get a sense of, you know, you're in a room full of people and you can kind of get a sense about different people before you even might go up to them and talk to them. And I'm not talking about something that's like super ESP psychic reading their mind, just like, I mean, here we're getting mystical, but the vibes they put off, you know, most people can kind of get a sense of other people. So all of those types of perceptions are related to sensory gating. Basically, if an area of interest and concern gets activated by your sensory gating organs and the neural networks, those sensory gates will open wider and allow more of the information to flow in. And then versus if it's not deemed as important somehow by your sensory gating, then the focus will narrow and you'll be less attuned to what's outside of your awareness. So like literally tunnel vision, you know, is an example, like a literal example. But basically saying the deeper parts of ourselves, our sort of biological operational system, only allows sensory input to touch our consciousness if it deems it important enough. And that's a pretty big deal to consider because it can be influenced by what we do. It can be influenced by what we expose ourselves to. It can have cultural influence and familial influence of like the things you're taught growing up and stuff like that. But he uses a really good example to illustrate it like through musicians. Okay, so they're going to have a more particularly widely open sensory gating channel that's related to a sophisticated auditory process more than the average person who's a non-musician. And so I bookmarked a little part of him explaining that. He says, in the primary auditory cortex, different neurons respond to different tones. Each neuron or neuron group in that region of the brain is in fact specific to a particular tone. The neurons adjoining those sensitive to one tone are themselves sensitive and respond to tones that are similar but slightly different. And so on across the whole range of sounds that humans can perceive, from long-term and extensive use in musicians, those neurons start to become highly sensitive to just the tiniest modulation in the incoming sound, as well as the neurons in the cortex that synchronize with each other, creating larger fields of perception on sound input. This increases the sensitivity of sound perception. And from the stimulus of continued and highly focused use, the neurons form in the organ, creating ever more sophisticated sound perception. So over time, the organ itself becomes more aware. It begins to actively look for and respond to fields of sound and communication in combination with the hippocampus, which actively works to pull inherent meaning out of the sound field. Thus, when a musician plays, a part of the self is highly involved in the expression of the sound. It's partnered with the conscious mind that then becomes an ally in the process of sound creating, which is the music. An exquisitely developed feeling sense comes into being, which blends together the parts that are concerned with sound generation, creating sort of a synesthesia of sensory perception and expression. This blended capacity is concerned with the exact expression of meaning through sound. And that's just like, wow. Like to me, using music and developing a finely tuned ear as one example, but you think about all of our senses and all the things we're exposed to every day in our lives, and it's like the potential of what we can enhance in our sensory perception is potentially limitless in some ways, if you think about it.
Well, it's like you know, they have a term. It's called ear training. You know, you do it in chorus. You know, you do it in singing. You do it in music. And it's basically, you know, I think, so to summarize what I think he's saying is that it's just, when you focus, whatever you put your focus on, you know, then you are becoming more aware of it, and you're, yeah. Right. And so, like, possibly, you know, like, because we've been trained to not look at the natural world, that we don't literally see it. So we're retraining. He's saying you need to look at it, and you're slowly going to be having to retrain yourself to see it. It's like in herbalism, we call it the green wall. Well, first you look at, like, you know, the forest or whatever, you look at some plants on the roadside and you're like, it's all green. They all look the same. But as you learn the plants, you're going to start picking out individual plants, and it's no longer just a green wall. It's extremely nuanced. So I think that's what he's saying. Just he's sort of broadening it out to like everything.
Yeah. Yeah, he's basically like saying we get trained, or we kind of train ourselves in a sense to varying degrees of perception and sensation. And that could be like, you know, other examples would be like, you know, building up a pain tolerance, or mastery of ability and things. Like, I mean, you're kind of talking about a sort of botanical mastery, but also like, you know, if you think about what it takes to do martial arts or excel in certain sports or creative pursuits, some of it's practice, you know, the training. Some of it might be some inherent talent that someone's just, you know, open to. But yeah, it's like some of it you have to like even have the awareness of the potential that you could even do the thing, so to speak, to create the avenue that you might actually open up and it actually occur.
Yes.
And the reason all that was pretty fascinating and important, I think, is because he delves into why and how humans aren't the only living creature that has sensory gating. And thereby, arguably, we are not the only living thing that possesses awareness. And thereby, you could say we're not the only living thing which can communicate. And he begins to extend that exploration into the realm of plants more as the book goes on. But because he's not an isolated thinker, because he sees and talks about and focuses on how everything connects, the book kind of meanders in that way, where he's going to talk about like these biological and human examples of these things, but then find a way to turn around and go like, oh, and by the way, here's how it is in the rest of the world too, in case you humans were too busy focusing on yourselves to notice. He actually digs into plant communication, like between plants of the same species and other species, like via the fungal mycelial networks, something that I think starting to get more understood and talked about with increasing frequency in biological science. So that's nice to see. But in this book's case, it's building on the idea of humans' potential to even connect in and have communicative capacity with plants. And I can't really go largely into that today because then I might as well read the book cover to cover. So suffice it to say that if you're intrigued by that notion, that's part of the reason you'll want to check out his books, because it sounds maybe kind of woo-woo when you just say it, but he lays pretty convincing argument for just the how to and why. Yeah, it's pretty cool. Yeah,
it's just for me, like a lot of times, I think one of my, personally, when I'm reading one of his books, I feel like I'm like, oh, I got it. And he keeps going on and on. No, I got it. I understand what you're saying. You don't have to say all that. But I think that's just his writing style. And just for me. So while you're reading, I was like, I know. But
yeah, this book doesn't do it as much as The Secret Teachings of Plants did, but it does do that. And I think part of that might be, I don't know how much he's been a teacher before and is a teacher, in a sense, even if not like employed as a teacher. But I think if in terms of teaching and learning, there's a little bit of repetition to lock things in. So it's kind of like a callback, right? It's kind of like saying, oh, remember that thing I talked about 4 chapters ago? Well, here's another way that it's even more important. You see how we built up to this, and haha, look where we are now. It's like,
I think also,
and you don't quite know where you're going, and then you get there, and then you look back and you're like, oh, okay.
I think also it's good because people might be less familiar with these concepts than I am. Like I've come from a certain upbringing. I've come from a certain place, and the cat is here.
Hi, Kitty.
Hi, listeners. Hopefully you're not hearing my lovely cat, Eugene. But if you are, that's my lovely cat, Eugene. So I think I don't want to say that how he writes is not good. I just want to say that, like, I think that one of the reasons he does include all of that is for people, of all backgrounds, just to make sure everybody does understand, because I think some of these concepts is more foreign to other people.
Well, and it's kind of helpful, right? Because like you were saying, even though all these quotes might make you curious to then have a jumping off point to look into who all these people are, if you don't have the time, the mental wherewithal, the energy, or the full-on interest to do that, which is totally fine, the nice thing about his books is he's able to distill it all into one source, so that it's like he provides the jumping off point if you want to go further, but he also is able to weave it together well enough, all under one roof, so to speak, that if you weren't going to have all that background or future ground and going to explore it, you can still get a lot of it just all in one place, which is very handy. Another totally interesting side of it was chapter 7 he titled Molecular Viriditas, and viriditas is a Latin word meaning greenness, but it can refer to like lushness and growth and things like that. And that particular chapter starts digging into more biological chemistry, such as serotonin. And that whole thing just blew my mind. He starts it off with some quotes from a New York University biology professor named Efren Asmatia, I think might be how it's pronounced. But he had some fascinating things to say. Efren said, evolutionarily, serotonin existed in plants before it even appeared in animals, and indeed serotonin may be tied to the evolution of life itself, particularly through the amino acid tryptophan, its precursor molecule. The serotonin neurons evolved from plants to the general regulatory system, which responds to external stimuli to produce structural changes to meet signals, and the system modifies itself to achieve stability needed for homeostasis. Now, I knew that there were, obviously herbal things that one could use to affect neurochemistry, such as serotonin. and certainly the baseline being the amino acid tryptophan. But this whole chapter digs into the complexity of that and how the plants actually use serotonin and how all that predated humans. And it does it in such a beautiful way because you can't walk away from it without coming to the obvious conclusion of how much more interrelated human beings are as a living species on this planet to plants, even, like, okay, sometimes people can kind of relate to animals, certainly their pets, but to try to feel personal with a plant is not as easy of a thing for people to conceptualize. But he's basically giving examples of how scientifically, like, we literally are very molecularly similar to plants. And then you could almost say we learned some things, like biologically, we developed and learned some things from plants. Like the plants were our teachers.
Right. Yeah.
In more than just a nice poetic sense, But something else along the biochemistry angle is he also talks about the ability for plants to affect different life forms. We're medicinally, we're familiar with compounds that can impact human health and animals, but he gives examples of like the mushroom cordyceps, the herbs baikal, skullcap, and rhodiola as infusions can be used to stimulate root tissue production in other plants, and that some herbal infusions can treat bacterial infection in the plants that they're administered to, or viral or fungal infection. He said there's a compound such as racinosteroids that are found in some plants that can be used as an infusion to treat a plant's immune function and make plants become protected from extremes of cold and drought. And I was familiar with like gardening hacks of using like a willow branch in a bucket of water with a bare root plant you want to try to grow out. And if you put the two together, there's hormonal compounds in the willow that stimulate root growth. So your little bare root can start to be more prolific before you go and put it in the ground. Or some people, I think, do a watering in.
Yeah, you can do a something called a willow water. Okay. I sent you a message. I don't. Yeah.
Yeah, I just, I was familiar with those kind of hack sort of concepts, but his wording was able to help me think of it in a whole new way, where suddenly you're looking at, oh, this is herbal medicine for plants, which is a very amazingly different way to be looking at it, and kind of opens the doors for more curiosity and exploration that way.
Yeah. Like the things that work on humans also can help a plant. Not that we use willow for rooting, but we use willow as an aspirin substitute. We use so there's lots of medicinal things that we use willow for. So that's real cool.
It makes me kind of curious, because I don't think there's been a lot of study into this at all. And if anybody's done it, it's probably mostly been him. But it makes me kind of curious, because a lot of times there's overlap with compounds, right? So it's like, if we know some compound in a plant has this particular benefit in the plant, then it might have that benefit in us. But I wonder how much has been done to look the other way, where if we happen to discover a compound in a plant does something for us, health-wise, biologically, if then someone could reverse engineer that and surmise, oh, well, if that helped the human get over there, whatever, maybe I could use it in some sort of treatment application on a plant the same way. Like, that's, he's insinuating, well, not even insinuating, he's giving some direct examples with specific plants that do that. But I don't know how that understanding came about. And I just wonder if it was through the reverse engineering. And if so, like, how much we could continue to discover that way if we were looking at plants from the direction of, well, it did this for people, so what will it do for plants? Instead of, well, it did this for the plant, what will it do for people? An interesting exploration.
Come on, cat. Stop beat. He's just meowing at me. He's so bad. Come on. I think it's. Come on. Oh. There's a cat. Come on. No. Go here. No. Anyway.
The joys of working from home.
Cat. Very bad. I think that we're not even really like, I think that's a few steps down the road for most of us. Like we're and I think a lot of times when we think about helping plants, we're talking about helping them through like habitat and like planting like companion plants and like doing all these things. So I think it's a really interesting concept, but definitely
that's another good example. It's a companion planning is like another good example of it, because the reason companion planning tends to work has to do with chemistry of the plants. Cohesive together, and either in terms of how they grow or in terms of what types of insects they attract or what types of things they repel, that they sort of work together in that way. But yeah, that's kind of another good example, at least in terms of like the biochemistry of plants helping plants, you know.
Right. His I think he's I think he's talking about it seems like he's talking about a little more, even more like
direct application,
research and science, and like like in a I can't articulate it. It seems different, even though it's like the same thing. But you know, I don't think that there has been a lot of thought or research or talk about that. From, you know, just as terms of, and I think that we're just like trying to accept again that plants are helpful to humans in a medicinal sense. So I think we're just a little, not that we won't get there, but we're just not quite there yet. So
I think a lot of his writing is ahead of its time in some respects, for sure. Like people read his books now and people respect him. He's done a lot in his life. He's been living a very full life. Hopefully still has many more years in his life to go. But I think that there's a lot of stuff he talks about now which might seem more conceptual, that I wouldn't be surprised if, say, 50 years in the future just becomes more, or maybe sooner if we're lucky, but I was trying to be realistic. 50 if we're lucky, might be become more common knowledge in some way, somehow. Maybe science will catch up in the collective, in the world's collective bubble or something like that.
Yeah, I think again, it's just, I mean, science could probably be there now. It's just the focus and what is valued. And I think that is more of the main issue than like our resources. We have so many resources on this planet and we're putting them to not so good use right now. So I think, but also some ideas, you know. Some ideas.
He kind of has a little, that's a good segue into this little part I pulled out that's sort of about delving into connection with the world. He says what we're really dealing with in this scenario that we call the world is an uncountable complexity of nested and overlapping self-organized systems, each of them an aspect, just like our white blood cells are to us, an aspect of a larger self-organized system that we could call Gaia, or the planet, which is itself only part of the larger organized scenario of the universe. And it is this irremovable intertanglement between foreground and background that frightens the neo-Darwinist reductionists so much. In their paradigm, niches exist independent of life, and then life fits itself into them, competing in the never-ending struggle for survival. And in the neo-Darwinianist world, the struggle for survival and niche specialization are the only reality. In spite of the fact, and this was interesting to me, that Darwin himself was much more flexible, he realized that his insight was just the beginning and that it would have to develop more complexity as its implications in reality became better understood. James Lovelock, the guy I mentioned as the originator of the Gaia theory, said that just like Newtonian physics was found to be incomplete at the particle and cosmic scale, so Darwinianism is incomplete when it tries to explain the world beyond the phenotype. In particular, it fails to see that organisms do more than just adapt to a dead and fixed world. The recognition that life shapes environment, which then shapes life, which then shapes environment, destroys the foundation of the neo-Darwinian system. It begins to destroy the concept of cause and effect. Evolution begins to take on some quantum characteristics, and linear thinking is no longer foundational. And I know you've heard me talk about the Japanese microbiologist Masanobu Fukuoka. I'm sure we'll get more into him in a book review in the future.
Definitely.
he pulled a nice quote from him, and this, I think, is very suited to his Masanobu Fukuoka's background in Eastern cultural sensibilities, because he says, nature is a fluid entity that changes from moment to moment. Man is unable to grasp the essence of something because the true form of nature leaves nowhere to be grasped. People become perplexed when they're bound by theories that try to freeze a fluid nature. Beyond every cause lies countless other causes. Any attempt to trace them back to a source leads one further away from an understanding of true cause. Nature has neither beginning nor end, no before or after, cause or effect. Causality does not exist. When there is no front or back and no beginning or no end, but only what resembles a circle or a sphere, one could say that there is unity of cause and effect, but you could just as easily claim that there just is no cause and effect in existence at all. And the famed poet and naturalist Goethe said, when something has acquired a form, it metamorphosizes immediately into a new one. If we wish to arrive at some living perception of nature, then we ourselves must remain as quick and flexible as nature and follow the example that she gives. So that's going back to like opening sensory gating channels more widely, leading to a thinning of the boundary between self and non-self, and it enables the movement of consciousness from a static sense of being in a place to an immersion into an entire scenario. So that it allows immersion into what he calls the metaphysical background, which I'm sure there's plenty of people that would just not, that term metaphysical background wouldn't sit well with them. But it's like, okay, well, what other term would there be? I mean, he's just illustrating the point that there's a lot more going on out here around us every day. It's just at our fingertips if we would just, pay attention.
For those of you watching on the YouTube channel, I popped up the book, One Straw Revolution, an Introduction to Natural Farming, that we did the quote from.
Oh, yeah, Masanobu Fukuoka.
Yeah, so if anyone wants to check out the book. Yes, so everything changes all the time. Like, I think we get tricked into thinking things are static, but they're not. Our bodies aren't static. They change every day. Our world isn't static. It changes all the time, like even just in things like new TV shows, like just basic, like mainstream stuff. The fashion changes, the weather's different every day. So I think this idea of things being static also helps trap us.
Yeah. And in a way, it kind of, if you think about struggle and pain and suffering and confusion, it's not that those aren't real things that we feel, but they're all oftentimes anchored to something that there was this thing that caused the suffering. And if we get trapped in that, you know, again, we start sort of pigeonholing ourselves and forgetting about the possibilities of how we might move through our suffering. And because everything's constantly changing, as much as that might terrify some people because it's scary, you know, change can be a scary thing because it's the unknown.
Definitely.
So is just as equally means there's the endless potential for hope. And if things are constantly changing, then there's always the chance that it's changing for the better, whatever you might want to define better as, you know.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And just in my like working world, when I was working for a big chain retail store, the job was horrible. And the people there, I was just like, why are you guys still here? Why? You get paid nothing. Like nothing. I was making $7.40 an hour in 2012. Okay, that makes, and the customers treat you bad. It's just, why would you stay? And there was this saying that people would say, well, it could be worse. And I was like, well, it could be better. Okay, sure, it could be worse. We could be homeless. Yes, but it could be better. Don't you want better? I know everybody has dreams. And I know it can be hard.
You got locked into the tunnel vision.
Oh, I know it can be hard when you feel like I'm so poor. What can I do to make my situation better? And it's often very discouraging. I mean, I'm sort of still there, you know, with, yes, my monetary situation has improved. Yes, possibly my job has improved, but like, I still have dreams of wanting it to be better. My job is fine, but I'm not doing what I want to be doing. You know, so I still carry that. And
you're not necessarily going to resign to.
Heck no. You know, occasionally for a day, I feel like I'm just feel very stuck and I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do, but even not knowing what to do is an opening, because you're just admitting, well, I just have to figure out something. There has to be something. So I think basically when we get discouraged over like the way the world is and the unfairness of our economic system and our social system, we have to remember that at some point we didn't have the 5-day work week. You know, at some point we didn't have the 8-hour day. So there's been changes, there've been revolutions. Yeah. So,
and sometimes when those changes happen, you know, a good majority of the populace just gets dragged along kicking and screaming, and they're like, that's horrible, it's gonna fail, it's gonna
ruin the country.
But then, you know, after a while, if it's normalized and it actually did prove beneficial, then people are like, oh, yeah, yep, that thing that we have now, that's a good idea.
Because it's really reasonable. You know, like people are asking for reasonable things. Like the ability to have 2 days off. Like, because
access
in fact, there was a thing where people were only getting 1 day off. I forget when that was. And once some companies gave employees 2 days off, their productivity went up because they got rest. They weren't as tired. So yeah. Anyway, that's my soapbox on that.
That probably ties into sensory gating in that so we might develop our neural pathways based on, things that we do or things that we're taught and exposed to. But to that end, if you're exposed to a constantly stressful, hectic environment and a mentality or a culture or a work ethic, in yourself, whatever it may be, that's almost feeling like forcing you to grind this axe, so to speak, it becomes harder and harder to envision that anything else even exists in the world. Whether for you, beside the point, but that it even exists in the world, and certainly believing that it could be possible for you, it gets hard to take the steps in that direction. You get more stuck feeling. And so, yeah, you could argue, days off, things like that. For mental health, that is an experience to help open sensory gating back up to rest and relaxation, which can open up more channels to maybe be open to exploring what other options are out there and stuff.
Just the idea that, like, when you're doing nothing is not a waste of time, because it's not. And we have this idea.
Yeah.
But it's false. Doing nothing.
Maybe that doing nothing is actually doing something for you.
Right. It's doing something for you. You're resting, you're processing, you're just, and it's nice to smell the roses. Well, that's nice. It's pleasant. What's wrong with that? Having some, do I have to have drudgery 24/7? Like, so yeah, you take that axe and you just, you whack it off. You whack off the rope to the grindstone, and but I think that a lot of people just don't. Yeah, they can't see it, and and we're talking about work now, but like it has things to do with our whole existence, which is what he is talking about in the book, and it just like just the expectations that you should do these things, and I think a lot of people are experiencing sickness because of the way that the world is structured. It's not good for our bodies, and
we're not grounded anymore. It's kind of losing touch. That dovetails nicely into the last little quote I pulled out, and it goes back to some of the sensory input and developing sensory awareness on the subconscious level. The part I'm going to read launches into it using music again as an example, just as a of how it kind of works, but it deals with communicatory expression. It says, musicians, once they find the balance point and once they synchronize with each other, begin to find musical expression that can only emerge from synchrony. They improvise specific communicatory expression out of a unified state. They do this by taking in from 1 millisecond to millisecond the musical communicatory expression coming from the other musicians, and then they create their own response, which is specifically bypassing the linear mind and the reductive language. Famous jazz pianist Duke Ellington, he says, once put it as, you've got to find a way of saying it without saying it. As the ever-changing musical communication is received, the receiving musician immediately can interpret that from a level that's below consciousness, just like a juggler who's like having to keep track of keeping all those balls in the air. So they're able to respond in a millisecond of time from kind of being in that zone that they're in, which is the unique dreaming state that this book is about. So when he talks about a dreaming state, he's not necessarily literally meaning you're asleep and you're having a dream. He's talking about it in a more poetic sense, about that undercurrent of connection between things and how deeply in tune we can be about things. So that a continual and ever-changing living communicatory expression begins to occur. Those of us who listen to the music, if we allow ourselves to drop into that dreaming place with the musician, we experience a unique and deep commentary on what it means to be human, caught up in the human predicament, embedded in the scenario that we know as the world, touched by the living cosmos every single day of our life, the response of our hearts to what is presented to our senses is awakened. And we all know how moving music can be. Just as it is with writers, this kind of musical expression is generated out of a unique and ancient form of cognition, an ancient way of gathering knowledge from the heart of the world, a type of cognition that is present in ecosystems long before it was ever in human beings. Aldo Leopold, who was a famous naturalist and poet and writer, said, "The song of the waters is audible to every ear, but there are other music in the hills by no means audible to all. To hear even a few notes of it, you must first live here for a long time, and you must know the speech of the hills and the rivers, and then on a still night, when the campfire is low and the Pleiades have climbed over the rim rocks, sit quietly and listen for a wolf to howl and think hard about everything that you've seen and just tried to understand. There is a continuous flow of interactive communication in ecosystems, each tiny part in response to the ever-living, never-stopping, always flowing communication that's coming from all of the tightly coupled members of the ecosystem and the environment to which it all is embedded. There is a language in the world that's older than our own. Ours is just a reflection of the older language. It's our take on it, and it's our innovation." And I thought that was a good thing to end with, and it was so perfect that you mentioned Robin Kimmerer from Braiding Sweetgrass referring to humans have a gift to give, because it's how that is, if you think about it, that our language and our communication and humans' capacity to share the gift that we bring is just a reflection, or we have the ability, if we recognize it, to be a reflection of something that's so much bigger and older than us, and we're just kind of tapping into it and putting our own spin on it. And you know, humans get high and mighty and separate ourselves. Look, we're so much better than everything, but we might do well to remember and acknowledge that it's not that we're better than it. We're just adding another spin on it. We're just putting our piece into the puzzle.
Right, and language was what she said. That was humanity's gift. Is our ability to have language and speech.
Wow, so it even tied in more perfectly than I
yeah. Yeah, it did. So, wow, okay. Well then,
the 3 remaining chapters that I haven't read yet are titled Ecological Function of the Human Species, so that's probably going to answer a lot of questions. The Road Not Taken, so mystery. And Becoming Barbarian is the name of the last chapter, so that's probably going to be fun. And then, as most of his books do, tend to end with an epilogue. And then, like I said earlier, the follow-up of reference content, because he's so diverse in his own learning and he wants to pass that on. The book contains a very detailed bibliography. And he also has a little section in the end, sort of not a chapter of the book itself, but like a little end piece that's titled Sensory Overload and Self-Care Taking. So I'll be interested to get to that part too, because it seems like after you read this entire book, you're probably going to be on sensory overload. So maybe you need to end with that to like bring it back down a notch, you know?
Right. Plus the world is sensory overload, and we need more self-care, or the ability to do self-care. All right. Well, that is quite
Intelligence in the Imaginal Realm by Stephen Buhner.
Yes. I will put a link in the show notes to, it'll be an Amazon link, but you know, pick your book source of choice. You know, our local bookstore has this book, so if you want to support local, but I'm just letting everyone know, I'm just putting in the Amazon since it's the most kind of accessible. But I want to thank everyone for joining us today. You can find this podcast will be up on Anchor. We are also on the Stories for the Earth YouTube channel. If you want to see my cat Eugene and our faces, our lovely faces. We also have a Instagram, as well as a Facebook group. So if you'd like to join the Facebook group, please do. and we will, you know, we'll have updates. There, if you're interested in like being interviewed, I would join the Facebook group. And also, we are doing some group panel type episodes, so you'll have the opportunity to get in on that through the Facebook group. So, all right. Well,
one day in the future, we could maybe interview Stephen Buhner. That'd be pretty cool.
Oh my gosh! Right? Put it on the list. We have quite a list of dream guests. So, and then he can really tell us some interesting stuff, and you know, and maybe some like, you know, more current thoughts that he has since he's written his books.
Yeah.
All right. So
2014 for that book, that might as well have been a lifetime ago at this point.
Yeah, so much stuff has happened. So much. So we will be back on the. You can find us every Wednesday. Well, actually, the second, third, and fourth Wednesday. Will be new episodes of this podcast. It's a little bizarre, but we had to work that out with our schedule right now. So at some point it will be every week, but so far it's the second, third, and fourth Wednesday of every month. And so we will see you guys on the 17th for the next episode. All right. Do you have anything to add, Ellen, before we say goodbye? Or?
Oh gosh, I think I've added enough.
All right.
Well, thank you everybody for tuning in. I hope that you feel inspired, or at least more curious than you were before.
That's right.
Go out and explore something.
Yes. All right. Bye.
Bye.